Welcome back to another episode of The Canon. I'm your host, Terry, and today talking about the story of the MCU. So going to give a little recap about, the actual story of what happened, and it's loaded with a lot of subjective thoughts. So, there's some things that are true. In fact, there's some things that's just my opinion. So, take that as you will. So, what is the story of the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Number one, it's the story of identifying an executive to really shepherd a universe and having a vision of how to play it out in all of its aspects, not just a long tail storytelling, but also what diameters to play, what things to tease, what things to keep secret, what things not to reveal along the way. And that comes in Kevin Feige, who earned that trust after the MCU started to get kicked off, and just kind of having the hindsight to really hedge your bets, as they say, to understand that, even if this doesn't pay off, if we set ourselves up in position to make it pay off, then it's going to be bigger than we ever would have thought. And we'll talk about that as we go on. So the story of the MCU starts with Iron Man, and it really is the story of the movie Iron Man. Jon Favreau, ushering in a comic book movie that was unlike what we've seen in vast majority. It's tough to say that when it came out the same year as The Dark Knight, which whole nother level of movie, but still, to that point, Nolan's Batmans were an outlier. And so Batman Begins very, much went under the radar with the mainstream. Dark Knight and Heath Ledger as the Joker, that kicked it off on a whole new level. And there's a whole conversation about DC versus Marvel as far as iconic characters and what that meant for the history of these franchises. So you didn't have that level of iconic characters there. And so Iron Man really had to strike a nerve. Iron Man couldn't just have been a decent movie. It couldn't go under the radar of the mainstream fans. And so you had Jon Favreau bringing in somebody who no one trusted at the time, Robert Downey Jr., but believed he could fulfill the vision of what Tony Stark was. And Tony Stark was very different. I talk to people about this a lot. The Tony Stark we know in the MCU is not what historically Tony Stark Iron Man was. He was very much your prototypical trying to follow in the shadow of his father, follow his footsteps and make him proud and do the right thing and change the world like his dad changed the world. But you have a little bit of that in the MCU, but it was very much a playboy, a just, a celebrity that went through a dramatic change that we could see over time really changed the way he thought. And that allowed fans to really get on board with this character in a way that you wouldn't get on board with a lot of other characters who are just goody two-shoes. That's the fact. If this was Captain America instead of Iron Man, the MCU doesn't kick off the same way. And so you get a guy that's very modernized, a guy that you can understand and sympathize with, and you go on this journey with him. And Robert Downey Jr. delivers the perfect redemption story, for a guy that had a life that was very close to this character. And so not only the movie hidden in a way where it was really great, but it was different. It showed us that comic book movies could be impactful. And I felt that way. I want to say this came out before The Dark Knight, if I'm correct. I'm not sure, but I remember going to see Iron Man in the theaters, and I was just, about to leave high school at the time. And I was like, wow. I mean, we see these superhero movies and it's just like a live action version of the cartoons. We don't really think too much deeply about it. But I'm like, wow, this movie really hit me because I didn't see Batman Begins until after I saw Dark Knight. And so I didn't see that till that was on TV. So I didn't even know about Nolan's Batman. So this was one of the first movies I was like, wow, okay. Then of course you had Dark Knight where like that's a whole nother level, but it changed, that whole year changed the feeling of superhero movies. But then in Iron Man, you got the post-credit scene. You got Nick Fury, played by a famous Samuel L. Jackson, and they drop a very famous MCU term, the Avengers. And that is what sparked the MCU. 100%. Because the fact of the matter is Thor and Captain America, the first Avenger, they followed Iron Man and they weren't as well received as people would have thought they would be. Those aren't revered movies by the populace in MCU history. There's people that love it, but for the most part, they were just okay. I very much thought Thor was boring, and I didn't like Captain America that much either the first time I saw it, where it was just like it was a period piece. And again, this is a goody two-shoes guy that was hard to kind of sympathize with for younger viewers. And it wasn't modern, it wasn't cool like Iron Man. And so these were two movies that really didn't hit hard with the audience. But the fact that there was this Avengers tease is really what amped it up. And so Iron Man 2 wasn't the greatest movie either, but you had the mention of Thor's hammer and seeing that in New Mexico. And that really is what ramped up the whole MCU. So you kicked off with a movie that struck a nerve with fans. You then hit that with the end teaser with the Avengers and a whole, not a new thing because end teasers happen, but this was a different way of marketing that was followed through a bunch of movies. And so then Incredible Hulk, as weird as that movie was, because you already had a Hulk movie and this was a different actor and this wasn't necessarily what people thought of as the MCU at the time. But then you hit the teaser with Tony Stark, who America fell in love with, and he's at the end of the teaser of Hulk. And now at this point, it didn't really matter what Thor and Captain America did because you were ready to see them team up. And then the MCU hit the, kind of the death knell with Avengers, and America changed. You saw a movie that changed the conversation about comic books. And not only where it was like, okay, this isn't for comic book fans, this is for cinema fans. No, comic book fans still were thoroughly enjoyed and satisfied by seeing Avengers brought to live action. But at the same time, you brought in cinema fans that was like, wow, this connective storytelling culminates in something pretty big and really fun and exciting. And that's what really changed the whole game, because after that, it really didn't matter what happened. Much like Thor in the first Thor and the first Captain America, it really didn't matter, because after you fell in love with the Avengers, you wanted to see these characters. You wanted to go see what they were up to, but more importantly, you wanted to know what was happening in the story, because the story was a lot bigger than we all thought it was. And so when we talk about cinematic universes, that is something that Marvel really created. That is the story of the MCU. That is the one underlining pin that puts everything together. I mean, yes, you have to have a strong movie with Iron Man to get interest, but none of this works if you don't create a storyline and a through line that people feel like they need to see. And at the time, I remember with Avenger, I'm like, this is genius. I'm like, this is genius marketing. Not even, movie making. It's genius marketing, because now you feel like I need to see, it's like watching a TV show where you need to see these other episodes. You're not going to watch the current episode without seeing the other episodes because you want to be caught up. Now, it's not 100% across the board with every fan, of course, but at the time, that's what the MCU felt like. It felt like I needed to be informed. And so really that's where it could have stopped. But then you hit Guardians of the Galaxy and you hit a new tone. You hit a new area in which they took the MCU and they showed to themselves, I think most importantly, that they can bring C-list characters to the forefront, and trusting in the process, trusting in these filmmakers, they can make these hits. And Guardians really, I think, gave the studio confidence to say, okay, we don't have to continue doing what we did with Avengers. We can go even deeper. And Guardians really kicked that off for a lot of people, which spiraled on to Ant-Man and Doctor Strange and, the movies of those types. But from Iron Man to Avengers, and then with Guardians, you really struck this chord where the MCU was in a position that people wanted to see what was happening and adding up the pieces to the story. And then people started to trust that Marvel could bring you new characters that, hey, it's super geeky, it's super, deep cut, but if I'm not into it, as a comic book fan, I understand that Marvel's going to bring me into it the right way. They're not going to give me too much. They're still going to make it fun, and they're going to give me a new character I can root for. And that trust is what came with Guardians, and that carries us all the way through Endgame. I mean, we could talk about every single movie, but really those are the, I would say, pressure points in the story of the MCU. And again, it all comes back to this idea of Kevin Feige really understanding the hedging his bets. And again, I don't know. It's much like sports. I don't know who made those decisions or who thought of it, I should say, but I know who signed off on the decisions, and that was Kevin Feige. And so when you have, Robert Downey ad-libbing in the first Iron Man saying, I am Iron Man, when you have the decision to put Nick Fury and tease Avengers at Iron Man, and when you put Robert Downey Jr. after Hulk to continue to tease this, and those are the decisions that say, hey, look, what does it hurt us if it doesn't work? If our movies flop and the MCU doesn't work, okay, fine. But if we do make it work, these are going to set us up to make big moves in the future. And that's pretty much what the MCU became after that. It was always adding in different ways that you can pivot. And so when things change, when movies change, when actors change, you could always step around and do different things because you left yourself a window and room to maneuver. And that's kind of from the vision of Kevin Feige, understanding like not to write himself in a box, and also where they were trying to get to in the end goal, which of course they didn't know what like Endgame. When they wrote Iron Man, they didn't know Endgame. They of course developed it throughout the time, but understanding, let's continue to keep the end goal in mind, or the end game in mind. And that way we could set a path that all these movies could fit on. And that really is the story of the MCU. Like I said, it started with piercing the mainstream audience, with a character that people really loved in Tony Stark. And once you were now in the mainstream and you decided to open up the possibility of the Avengers, that's when you started bringing people in. And then Avengers is when you really did your signature victory to say, we are here, we have arrived. And then from there, you had the fan base amassed until you continued to show them that we're not just Thor, Iron Man, and Captain America. We got more than that. And that's when the MCU went to a different level. So anyway, go to the comment section. Let me know what you think about my thoughts on the MCU and their story. Are there points that I'm missing, that are other aspects that you think were more important or that I left out? Get the conversation started, share it around, thumbs up, subscribe. And remember, if you heard it here, it's official canon.